to hear his story. I sat down with him, and it was fun learning and hearing about what he went through, because it gave me a glimpse further into what my parents and my family went through. And of course, the conclusion there was perfect as far as I thought. It's like
Yeah.
you couldn't make it up any better, really.
Paul Dragu is a Romanian American writer who was the collaborative author on the book Defector with Mark Hobafcovich. Paul was the amanuensis, or the person, that's the big word for the person who helps another person write a book, and that's the word for the day. And he lent his literary talents to the book about the escape from communist Romania of Mark Hobafcovich. And Paul comes through. There's some really great writing in Defector. First off, Paul, I'd like to thank you for coming on, and I wanted to ask you, what was it like being in communist Romania as a young man?
Well, Daniel, I'll be honest. I left around when I was 8 or 9, and my memories are scant. I would say a lot of my memories are passed down through my parents, who told me the stories of why we got out of there. Um, but as a kid, I remember my grandparents had a farm, and the reason that's significant is because that farm produced or was able to save us a lot of the anguish that came from people who lived in communist Romania, mainly because of rations. And so I think that's a huge reason why that's one of the things I remember the most is simply my grandparents' farm. I also remember, going to church, and the reason that that's also significant is because we had later learned, or I would learn, is that the communists would have informants in the churches as a way to, because it was always the people in church, and especially the Protestant sects, who they were kind of worried about or had a harder time controlling.
Yeah, well, let's touch that because I wanted to circle back around to the fact that in the United States, George Bush did something called faith-based initiatives, whereby the state was giving money to the churches to essentially act as informants as well. And I wanted to inform that with let's go back to 1989, right? So in 1989, the Romanian regime falls, and Ceausescu is executed on Christmas, and
With his
when I
wife.
look, yeah, exactly. And so I look back now, and in the book, Mark Hobafcovich even says that even with this remove of time, he doesn't know why exactly the events happened. But with kind of hindsight being 2020, as I'm reading it, I am shocked by the fact that when I lived through 1989, I barely paid attention. The news was just background noise to me. But in 1989, four countries, five, I think, actually, fell. Poland had their revolution in '89. Then there was Czechoslovakia, there was Bulgaria, and of course, in this book covers the Romanian kind of destabilization and collapse. And only in retrospect and looking back do I realize that this was probably in anticipation of the creation of the European Union in '93. So what you had, the events were the Eastern Bloc countries collapse in '89, '91 the Soviet Union collapses, '93 the EU comes in, and then just a few years after that, in 9/11, in September, of 2001, you have all of these changes, almost as if the post-World War II order was being, destabilized and reshaped into the so-called New World Order. And so you see it moving from east to west. And in 2020 and 2021 now, we're on the precipice of the Great Reset. And so I'm seeing a lot of the same things that happened in these Eastern Bloc countries happening here, like for instance, informant culture, the government using churches to spy on people, like all these curtailments of civil liberties. And I just wanted to see if you saw any kind of similarities as well.
In a way, that the way to, I think, because I've thought about the similarities. Obviously, I have having a background in journalism. One of the biggest similarities to me that jumps out is the propaganda that comes through the media in the same way it was shaped in communist Romania. Over there, of course, it was 100% state controlled, but the goal was the same, which it was toward leftist ideology and policy. And obviously, we're seeing a large part of that, and then. But essentially, I think what it comes down to, and the similarities I'm seeing most is just control. Lots of control on what you can think. Obviously, although the levers and the gears are a little different here in the United States, they're trying to accomplish nonetheless. They want to control what you can say, what you can think, And obviously in 2020 it was a crazy year, and hopefully it was an anomalous year. But they controlled where you can go. I mean, our mobility, and to some degree, it's still being controlled. And as in the book that I wrote, as we saw with Mark, and as was with my father, who also tried to defect, and I have lots of relatives. The control of mobility was that as well, is that you couldn't leave. You couldn't just, we had visas and we couldn't leave. And there was lots of people like that. They had visas, they had sponsorship from Western countries because that's where everyone would go. But the Romanians were like, no, you can't, you can't just go. So essentially the similarities come down to control.
Yeah, exactly. And we're seeing that now with like vaccine passports, and they're trying to establish more control of the population. And I noticed another similarity as well. Um, Only in looking back, do I remember as a kid, the only story that they were giving, like circa 1989 or 1988, regarding Romania. The international press largely ignored Romania, but all of a sudden you started seeing this demoralization campaign where you would see stories of Romanian orphanages. And George Harrison and his wife went down, and all these people went down, and it became a thing. Romanian, orphanages and the evil treatment of people under the communist regime, which was all technically true. But in looking back at it, it really looks like a demoralization campaign, like they were manufacturing consent for collapsing that society. And so you look now in the United States, and they're using very similar demoralization campaigns with children in cages, and it's very uncanny, as if they're trying to create the rationale to collapse the United States, the controlled demolition of the United States, as that kind of domino, the falling of dominoes from east to west is going. And I kind of was struck by that.
Yeah, I did it. I guess I didn't notice that, and I'll be honest. I've done a few talks on this, and I apparently had never really figured out what it was with the orphanages. Why there was this huge. I know there was like this world campaign, because apparently there was just more orphanages and more orphans in Romania. But I didn't notice that. But now that you bring it up, good
Well,
job.
they did the same thing with Iraq. In the run up to the Iraq War, they had a diplomat's daughter come out and lie, essentially, saying that the Iraqis were taking the babies off the incubators in Kuwait, and it was very similar kind of, oh, they're hurting the babies. We have to rush in to collapse this country. And so like I said, the rhetoric with children in cages and America is an evil, racist, slave owning, the delegitimization of the country is startling to me. Some of the similarities. I wanted to touch on one of the other things too. One of the notes that I made was Jackie Gleason, the famous actor who did The Honeymooners. He said that, and this always stuck with me. He said that comedy is when a man is larger than his circumstances, and drama is when a man is smaller than his circumstances. And when I was reading the story of Mark Hobafcovich trying to escape communist Romania, this was a man very much smaller than his circumstances, and he's trying to get out of this Kafkaesque bureaucratic machine, and he's trying to acquire more freedom. But you managed to make it comic at times. This was inherently a drama because he's smaller than his circumstances, but you managed to inject little comedic flourishes all throughout it, and I really liked it. And I also wanted to mention too that I really liked the writing your writing as a prose stylist jumped out at me. I liked your little descriptions of people in a huddle looking up, and the man lifts his head as a periscope and looks around, or another one was his eyes stuttered awake. These little poetic prose flourishes, and it was extremely readable, and it read like a thriller. It read like at points like the prose was reminiscent of like a Jack Reacher novel or something. I really enjoyed it. But anyway, if you could speak to that, like the inherent drama, but you kind of like seeing kind of like humanity within that. I was wondering if you had any insights on that.
Well, it's funny that you say, because the way the book came about is a friend of Mark's, who is I guess a novice screenplay writer, had written a screenplay with it, and they had tried to sell it. They tried to pass it off and get it out there, see if anybody would take it. And I don't think they had any luck. But anyway, Mark knew that I was writing. I was freelancing, which means I was making no money. But anyway, he saw my talents, or he liked what I was doing. He liked what I was reading, or what I was writing. And he said, "Hey, look, I got the screenplay. Would you want to look at it and see if you think this would make a good book?" And the screenplay, it jumped out as me. I saw it as a thriller as well, and I'm reading the story and I'm thinking it's like, man, one of the basics that you learn in I took some creative writing classes was sometimes you got to start right where the action is. You got to hook them,
Mhm.
And but I thought there was a lot to it. He had a really fascinating story, but as I like to tell people a lot this is a story it's very common. I had mentioned earlier, my father had tried to defect, but he wasn't successful. My uncle did. I have two uncles who successfully defected. So this is a story that, in a way, could be lots of Romanian stories. They're always the same in the sense that they try to escape, to defect under the cover of night. There's always there's the risk. There's a risk of dying, of course, because these border agents weren't exactly known for their morality, and obviously the whole thing was so corrupt. There was unlikely, like, if they did something wrong, like shoot somebody. It's not like they were going to get in trouble. But it seemed like an exciting story. It seemed, you had all the elements, the plot, the climax. Of course, you got to have the conflict and the resistance, and he had that. And I like the end, especially because there's this ta-da moment, right, where he realizes, like, he eventually, spoiler. Should we give any spoiler alerts?
Sure, go ahead. Shoot.
He eventually gets to what he thought was, the promised land, which is the West, and maybe we won't say where in the West he got, and he realizes there's more to it than that, and so he has another breakthrough. So I thought it had lots of great elements, and me being a Christian, the way it finished up with that, his ultimate epitome and the ultimate liberty that he found. It was a fun ride. It was a fun read. I mean, it was fun to hear his story. I sat down with him, and it was fun learning and hearing about what he went through, because it gave me a glimpse further into what my parents and my family went through. And of course, the conclusion there was perfect as far as I thought. It's like
Yeah.
you couldn't make it up any better, really.
Yeah, I was just about to say that because there's that theme of kind of the moral collapse, right? When people become materialists, and that's basically like the crude materialism of Marxism. And the Romanians, in defense of their system, they were looking at the West and all the surpluses of the West, and they were saying, "Oh, there's materialistic Westerners. Don't be like them, be like us." But then they removed, largely, this spiritual core to the society, and the state becomes the church. The state becomes God,
Yeah.
and so they were decrying the materialism of the West while they were essentially materialistic and atheistical in a sense, very very repressive. And the book starts out in Christmas of 1980, and I thought there was a kind of circular, logic to it, that in Christmas of 1989 is when the Ceausescu regime falls. So it was almost like a gift to Christians. And I really like that theme of when he escapes to the West, and he at first he's excited to see all the plenty, the surpluses, the stuff, but then he realizes that there's a certain slavery in that too. There's a slavery in vice, and it kind of throws him back on this rediscovery, this inner peace that he finds when he returns to kind of a more traditionalist, Christian base. And I wonder, if that's what you were trying to go toward.
I don't think so, man. I just wrote it like it was. you know, uh, it's really what happened, but you know what? It ends up that way because of the way he grew up. And there was actually a great parallel between the way he grew up and I grew up, and us coming full circle. Me and Mark, just talking to you, I realized that me and Mark had, in a way, obviously I had never had the defect, but we had a similar trajectory, in the sense that we grew up in that religious house. Like, we both grew up in a religious house, but then we kind of questioned a lot of stuff, and we veered towards that, and we went on this path, this detour, if you call it. And in the end, we both came back full circle, realizing all that stuff that we had learned, it came back to us, and we realized that there was something to it.
Mhm.
And so you it's funny how those things, I think they subconsciously played out, all those parallels that you're talking about. They I don't know if I don't know if I was cognizant of any of that. I recognized a good story, and I had lots of fun writing it. And I, like I said, the one thing I did realize is it speaks for a lot of experiences. I think people who will read Defector will get a glimpse into how a lot of people, a lot of their journeys. Not just Mark Hobafcovich. There's lots of Mark Hobafcoviches, and I don't know if there's hundreds, if there's thousands, perhaps even up into to a million people who defected, who yearned for something more. They risked their lives and they defected, and the West, especially here in the United States, is full of Mark Hobafcoviches.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale, but it's also a great read. It's a wonderful thriller, and I'd like to thank you, Paul, for coming today. And in preparing for this, a thought popped into my head that talking to a stranger is like discussing the writings of an author whose work you haven't read. So luckily, I read this and I read it with great interest, and it went really quickly. It just was boom, boom, boom. The action was incredible, and I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a few words with you about that. And I would encourage anybody watching this video to go out and buy Defector by Mark Hobafcovich and Paul Dragu.